Good afternoon. My name is Maria Noesi, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Kognito, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Sexual Misconduct Prevention, Virtual Training for Students. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded. A copy of the presentation will be sent to you after the webinar, so don't worry about taking notes. We've also dedicated time at the end where our presenters will answer as many questions as possible, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation. I also want to invite you all to participate in a couple of poll questions. So if you can come and look at the screen, the first poll question is, does your institution currently provide sexual misconduct prevention training to students? Yes, no, or not sure. I will give you a few seconds to respond, and then I will share the results. Great, so it looks like the majority of you currently said yes. So the majority of you currently do provide sexual misconduct training to your students. Now for the second poll question, for those of you that said yes, how prepared are your students to navigate difficult situations related to sexual misconduct? Would you say they're very prepared, somewhat prepared, not prepared at all, or not sure? And again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to respond here. Great, thank you for sharing. So it looks like again, 100%, all of you that responded said they're somewhat prepared and they could benefit from additional training. Again, thank you for participating in both of those polls. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Kognito, our mission is to combine the science of learning and the power of conversation to provide individuals in our communities with the skills that can improve their social, emotional, and physical health. And more specifically in the higher education space, for over a decade now, we've partnered with colleges and universities to provide their faculty and students with the knowledge and skills around topics like mental health and suicide prevention, military cultural competency, and now sexual misconduct prevention. We're also in the process of creating a simulation for students that focuses on substance use prevention. Now, with that, I want to introduce today's presenters. Today, we are joined by Glen Kraemer, who is a founding and managing partner of employment law firm Hirschfeld Kraemer LLP. We're also joined by Megan Heckel-Greco, who is the Associate Director in the Office for Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Support, and a Deputy Title IX Coordinator for students at the University of Chicago. Finally, we're also joined by Kimberly Wieland, who is a Product Manager for Education at Kognito. I want to thank all of them for joining us, and I now want to hand it over to our presenters to get us started with today's presentation by telling us a little bit about the work that they do. And we'll go ahead and get started with Glen. Take it away.
Thank you, Maria. Since 1997, our firm's practice has been exclusively devoted to higher education and employment law issues, and my colleagues and I work with institutions of higher ed throughout the United States. For the last 13 years, I have served as the external general counsel for Pomona College in Claremont, California. I'm really delighted to be involved with this program today because my emphasis for my entire practice since really 1987 has been on training with regard to sexual harassment, campus and workplace violence, and I run and serve on and train threat assessment and campus behavioral intervention teams as well. One of the things that I serve today for is to occasionally address that little tiny elephant in the room, which is known as the new Title IX regulations. And what I will do throughout the program is highlight areas where, ironically, if anything, now more than ever, because of some of the impact that the Title IX regs are going to have, whatever version we end up with, depending on what happens in the courts as they review it, undoubtedly. What I will suggest is, if anything, the new Title IX regs underscore the absolute importance of training, and not just training, but training that's really focused, as this product does, on bystander engagement and on some of the definitions that we're going to be talking about with regard to the broader concept of sexual harassment. So I look forward to the program. Megan?
Great, thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Megan, and I, as Maria mentioned, am a Deputy Title IX Coordinator for Students and Associate Director in the Office for Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Support at the University of Chicago. I obtained my master's degree in counseling and have been in higher ed for close to a decade now, having previous experience in residence life. So, of course, I'm really excited to join the conversation as a subject matter expert for Kognito when thinking about supporting our students who might be experiencing or affiliated with some experience related to sexual misconduct. During my time as a subject matter expert, I've really enjoyed working with the team at Kognito in addition to other subject matter experts from really inception to this point of sharing all of the great work with you all. Everything from characters to scripts to different simulations that we'll have a chance to talk through today has been really exciting to work through and has been done with a lot of really great intention. So I'll turn it over to Kim now to introduce herself.
Thanks, Megan. This is Kim Wieland. I'm the project manager here at Kognito. So part of my role is really being able to work with our subject matter experts and our internal team to find ways to use our innovative platform and learning style to really help drive change. As Maria mentioned earlier, our goal is to help improve the emotional and physical health, and we do that by really helping to improve self-efficacy through a deeper engagement in the learning. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that as it relates to this product specifically today. I'm really excited that both Megan and Glenn, two of the SMEs who were on this project, were able to join us today. We'll spend a little bit of time here at the beginning just doing a quick overview of the current landscape, and then we're going to spend most of the time talking about the product, and we'll dive a little more deeply into both the learning model and the specific pieces that are taught throughout this product. So I'll turn it over to you, Megan, to give us a little bit of background on the current landscape.
Great, thank you, Kim. So as Kim mentioned, this is really a framework for our conversation today and really for the Kognito tool itself. The current landscape in higher education as it relates to sexual misconduct, as Glenn mentioned as well, prevention is still really central to all of our work. The Association for American Universities completed a largest of its kind survey in 2019 to really discuss this concept, to discuss the community impact around sexual misconduct, and some highlights here are found on the slide, again, pertinent to the conversation today. We are still finding that the 1 in 4 statistic is still truer than ever. That statistic can sometimes be dismissed as being old, but again, in this 2019 study, we found that 25.9% of undergraduate women are still reporting sexual misconduct. There's an overwhelming population of students on campus that experience harassing or harassment-like behavior. Our transgender, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming student community reported over 50%, so 65.1% reported experiencing harassing behavior. And additionally, undergraduate women reported 59.2% of experiencing harassing behavior. So again, really just wanting to circle back around to the importance that prevention is in this conversation. Additionally, something that we are all going through right now. Sorry, Maria, if you can take us back a slide. Something that we're just going through right now is just the current virtual landscape that we're all in. It is lending itself to experiences surrounding online harassment, thinking about previous trauma or previous instances of sexual misconduct. And again, this conversation for prevention is even more critical given some of these new environments that our students are finding themselves in. And then next slide, Maria. And going off of that, just some new realities and key areas as we think about prevention. The president of AAU, Mary Sue Coleman, in her report following the 2019 study, really indicated the importance of higher ed institutions continuing to train and educate first-year undergraduate students in addition to transfer students on sexual misconduct prevention. And so with that, a few key areas of prevention as we sort of think about the future of sexual misconduct prevention include continued emphasis in training for new students, including transfer students, consent and healthy relationships, not only in person, but again, online. Navigating domestic violence resources during COVID. Nationally, we've seen an increase in domestic violence experiences being disclosed given the virtual landscape. And again, thinking about what tools are available for students to support them during this time. And then finally, better serving our marginalized student communities in prevention education. Again, the LGBT community, including our trans communities, students of color, first-generation students that, again, absolutely deserve the prevention work. And I will go ahead and transition it over to Kim now to really dig into the value of meeting our students where they are.
If I could, if you can go back just one slide, I just wanted to chime in because I think there's a couple important points that you made I want to elaborate on, Megan. I want everyone to realize that we have a perfect storm going on right now. And with the COVID-19 uncertainty and the introduction of the Title IX regs, it's pretty essential that we now have new approaches to training, not only from an access perspective to ensure that, in fact, the training is online, but I want everyone to realize that, as all of us are on this call, we are really in the greatest level of uncertainty from every constituent's perspective. We're uncertain whether we're going to reopen. We're uncertain how that reopening will look. In many cases, we're thinking of doing a bookend approach where we're having freshmen and seniors in a residential setting together. As not only a higher ed subject matter expert, but frankly as a consumer of higher ed services, and specifically looking at my own youngest going off to college, that uncertainty, I think, coupled with what I believe will be a chilling effect from the new regs on people coming forward, this type of simulation training, I think, is now more essential than ever, particularly as accessible as it is through a digital platform. So I did want to mention that, and we'll revisit this issue of the kind of cataclysmic effect of the COVID issues we're dealing with the new regs. I think we have to look at that very carefully.
Thanks, Glenn.
Sure thing.
So why did we as Kognito decide that it made sense to build this product? We've had a mental health product for around 10 years. And as we have worked with universities, they have asked us over and over again if there was a way for us to look at doing some of these other topics. And the reason for that is because in our platform, we are able to allow students to not only learn about these skills and the key information that they need, but also give them a place to practice these skill sets, to really not only more deeply embed that, but to also meet those students where they are, knowing that they're coming to campus with different attitudes, different beliefs, different levels of where they are in these skills. And so within this model, we're able to make sure that they are getting to make choices that we are then able to provide them feedback on and really meet them where they are, so that we're not only promoting positive health behaviors, but we're also being able to reduce some of the negative ones as well. So as we go through today, we're going to treat it a little bit like a conversation. So we're going to go through each of the sections of the product, and Megan and Glenn, I'll have you guys chime in as we go through. So I wanted to start at the overarching learning objectives for this product. We really wanted to make sure that students understood the importance of preventing sexual assault, understanding what the warning signs were, and really ultimately empowering them to feel like they had the ability to have an impact on the overall safety and culture of the campus in a positive way. Really being able to understand how they can intervene. So we do cover bystander, and as well as respond effectively in situations where they might be talking to someone who was affected by sexual assault or misconduct, knowing what resources are available to them, being able to refer a peer to them, but also knowing what resources are available for them to access themselves. And importantly, really determine when consent has or has not been given, and know specifically how to ask, how to give, and how to not give sexual consent. So this is the overall content structure. Just a couple of things that I want to point out. The way that we do this is that what we call a didactic is where a student is going to be given key information that key information and knowledge. In that, they are then either going to be put into a check for understanding, as they are in the first module, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, where they can apply that within different scenarios, or they'll very quickly be put into a practice scenario. So in bystander, in consent, and supporting a victim, they do the didactic where they receive the knowledge that they need, and then they go quickly into a practice scenario. The reason that we do that and we have that structure is because we know that if we're able to put the student in the situation where they can take what they've just learned in the didactic and put them in the ability to practice, they're able to do what's called active experimentation. And by being able to choose what they're going to say next and practice those skills, we know from the science of learning that that's actually going to help them turn these abstract concepts into something much more concrete and embed that learning for them. But also, really importantly, it gives them critical reflection points. It gives them the ability, as they're thinking about what to say next, as they're receiving that feedback from the coach, they're really thinking about how they need to tweak their behavior, what changes they need to make on their own behavior. And those critical reflection points is really what makes this transformative learning. After each of those practice scenarios, they get a dashboard. A dashboard is based on it's feedback based on what they chose within the simulation, and we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. We do present an ideal path for each of those. So if no matter, depending on what path they chose through those conversations, they do have the chance to go through a modeled ideal path and see what that would look like, so they can see that modeled for them. And then they'll go through a check for understanding where they can apply those skills to different scenario-based questions. So let's dive into the actual content. The product starts at the introduction with getting to meet your coaches, Alex and Malcolm, who will be coaching throughout and will stay with the learner throughout. In this scenario, Alex is a victim of sexual assault, and so is able to begin to introduce students to some level of that first person, building empathy, and bringing them into this learning model. They are then introduced to the common language and the definitions around sexual misconduct. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Glenn, to talk a little bit about the importance of that common language and the role of these definitions.
Thank you. So as we all know, definitions matter. They matter for not just legal reasons, but to create a common lexicon, a common vocabulary at our institutions, so that when we refer to issues with regard to sexual harassment or domestic violence or interpersonal relationship violence, that we all know what we're talking about. Now, I know everybody on this call has read every page of the 2,000 pages of the regs, but not wanting to be redundant, but just want to be very clear, we also know that the definitions, if anything, with regard to the non-criminal elements that Title IX looks at. So as we all know, Title IX is really tracking, for the most part, the definitions under the Violence Against Women Act with regard to criminal sexual misconduct. But it goes further. In going further, however, the new regs arguably have restricted the definition of sexual harassment. And bluntly, I'm going to certainly encourage those institutions I work with to make sure that their definitions subsume and go beyond the law, and that to merely meet the definitions under the new Title IX regs, I think would frankly not meet the needs of any campus with regard to what sexual harassment is, particularly the non-criminal elements of sexual harassment. So one of the things that I really appreciated about this program, and that certainly from our vantage point of looking at it from a compliance perspective was very important to us, is that the definitions subsume and go beyond the law. And they really engage in best practice thinking with regard to how to think through the lens not only of the law, but of really the practical implications of defining sexual harassment on a college campus. The other thing I wanted to mention, and it's actually very specific to these virtual coaches, I found this a very moving program. And my compliments to Megan and to the staff at Kognito in creating it. I do a lot of training, and I create training programs, and I've seen them live, and I've seen them virtually or digitally using actors. But this is content that, strangely, and I can't necessarily put my finger on it, but I will share with you, if anything, I found that my empathic response to these characters was almost more profound, that in dealing with intimate, awkward, or challenging issues, the use of the simulation technology, if anything, was more effective and more poignant. So I did want to highlight that, and I certainly would encourage folks to take a look at this, and I'd be interested to see whether they have a similar reaction. But that's what I have on this slide, and I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Glenn. After each of the sections, the students will go through, again, what we call a check for understanding. And these aren't just questions that ask them what's the definition. They're actually scenarios where they have to think about what's happening in this scenario and provide answers that are going to show that they have actually engaged with this in a way that they would actually be able to follow through on some of these. This example is from later in the program where they're looking at different resources that are available to them on campus. But the ones that come right after the definitions, I do want to highlight these and as they're used throughout the simulation. This gave us an opportunity to continue to expand the different types of scenarios that students were introduced to and the diversity of different types of sexual misconduct. So we have named it that very specifically because it does cover a broad spectrum. And one of the things that Megan brought up earlier around the realities of what does online harassment look like, what does consent in a virtual world mean, we very specifically made sure that not only were there diverse scenarios on who was involved, but there was also diverse scenarios in the settings that they were in. So some of them are going to show harassment over text. Some of them will include things like sharing pictures without someone's consent. So we did want to make sure that we took every opportunity to expand to all of the different audiences and the diversity of the types of sexual misconduct that may be happening. So I'm going to have Megan do most of the talking on this slide. Bystander is a huge piece of this and is a huge piece on most campuses. What we really wanted to do in this scenario is, after they've gone through the didactic and understood the importance of bystander skills and what those 3 Ds are. I know that some schools have 4 Ds. That 4th D of documenting is actually taught later on in the simulation. We stuck with the 3 Ds here of delegate, distract, and direct, because those are the ones that they're going to actively practice within this scenario. The one thing that we wanted to make sure that we were doing is to make this as realistic to something that they might experience, so that when they do have that moment where they want to intervene, they have truly felt that they were able to practice and have a higher level of confidence and self-efficacy to do that, and it feels very natural. So that was the goal of this. Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how you guys came up with this specific scenario and then the importance of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kim. So like Kim mentioned, we really tried to build all of these simulations to try to capture as many complexities to the student experience that we possibly could. Of course, everyone is going to have a different experience, and unfortunately, every experience with sexual misconduct can sometimes look and feel, of course, very, very different. I know in my role in Title IX, but even previously just managing student conduct, there were a huge number of disclosures that involved some level of assessment of incapacitation or just a very explicit, alcohol consumption, overconsumption, intoxication, that of course is a really heavy intersection point when students might be experiencing some sort of sexual misconduct, or consent starts to become a little bit grayer. As Glenn mentioned earlier, kind of leading up to this conversation, it's one thing to go through a training and learn the definitions and be able to sort of picture what an ideal scenario of obtaining consent could look like. But these simulations, I think, do a really great job of, again, sort of building in that complexity that is a very realistic student experience. So, for example, Logan and Sarah, these 2 characters, they're at a friend's party. They're just kind of hanging out, and of course, there is alcohol involved. And is that every scenario that happens? Of course not. But it's certainly, we would be remiss if we didn't think about adding that complexity of incapacitation into the conversation. So, again, I, just kind of want to, invite Glenn in the conversation if you have anything additional to add, but yeah.
Yep, I do. Thank you, Megan. So just anecdotally, I'm going to throw out a name some of you may not know, Nicole Hockley. But you may know her son, and it's a tragic story. Dylan Hockley was one of the 20 youngsters who was killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And Nicole Hockley created a foundation called Sandy Hook Promise, and I've had both the honor and the challenge of following Nicole on stage at various threat assessment professionals conferences. And Nicole actually asked us to think about bystander engagement, as she focuses particularly on K through 12 campus violence, but it applies strenuously here as well. That we think of not really bystander engagement, because it's almost an oxymoron in terms of when you think of a bystander, you think of somebody who's passive. What this training does, what we're all trying to do on our campuses, is really create upstanders. And sometimes that upstander, as we're going to see actually a little bit later on in this program, isn't necessarily observing something in the moment, but they're standing up for their friend, they're helping a friend, they're engaging in thoughtful, informed communications to either intervene, as this particular scenario does, or to provide support. And so I will tell you the other thing that I look for, and it's hard to find, and I found it with this training, and it really was really enlightening and very pleasing to see, is that we're really focused on creating upstanders within the student community. For me, that to me is that's a critical, essential piece of training, particularly, again, given that I think the new Title IX regs are going to have something of a chilling effect with regard to people coming forward due to some of the understandable due process considerations that are going to be outlined in the regs. With that, Kim, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Glenn. I love how you put that around creating upstanders and thoughtful communication. That's really something that we are so focused on, and when we're doing this bystander conversation and the other conversations as well, what we're doing with the feedback is not only helping direct students more towards positive behaviors, reducing some of those negative ones, but also really emphasizing some of ways they can just begin to change their communication a little bit to really be more of that upstander. In the bystander conversation, we are able to embed feedback that helps them know how to intervene and have some of those conversations in a way that helps bring down people's barriers as far as being pushing back or not wanting to walk away or those types of things. And we're able to embed those communication techniques in here. When we get to the supporting a friend one, I'll talk even more about some of the communication techniques that are embedded there. So each student actually gets a feedback dashboard just like this after each of those conversations, and they are able to see feedback that is based on the choices that they made within conversation. And the way that we build this feedback is that while it is meant to be corrective in some areas, it is always written in a positive framing. So they're receiving feedback in a positive framing of what they did well, things they could improve and do better, and we know that that leads to much stronger actual motivation to change those behaviors and ultimately confidence to use these skills. So let's talk a little bit about checking for consent. Again, there is going to be a didactic where they learn the knowledge about what consent is. That's where we go over the concept of informed, enthusiastic, and continuous. But we felt it was really important. It's one thing to know those things. It's another thing to be able to be put in a situation where you actually have to be reflective of your actions. And so we have embedded within this different pitfalls that students typically say. We do a lot of role-playing conversations with students about how these conversations typically go. And so things like pressuring, guilting, all of those types of things are embedded within this so that we can give feedback to students based on sort of the typical things that they would hear in these conversations. It's really important to note that there is no ability to continue past a certain point in this. So there is never going to be anywhere close to an assault. If you keep picking those types of responses where you're continuing to push, you will be forced into a fail state. You'll get a message that says, you need to start over, and they'll go through again. We also wanted to make sure that the feedback that was given to this was in first person. We call it dynamic feedback. So at the end, you actually hear from Kate about how she was experiencing that moment and what her thoughts and emotions were, to really, again, help that critical thinking of cause and effect and really embed that in the learning. So Megan, I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about this because this was such a key piece for this product.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I really just want to underscore the emphasis that we placed on kind of this force-fail component in addition to the commentary from Kate and how she's feeling when thinking through, you know, again, realistic scenarios and letting students really try on what could potentially work for them. It was really important to not only recognize and have users recognize the importance of consent, but then recognize the impact of their actions, and in some cases, potentially those harmful actions. And again, which is why I think that dynamic feedback, just sort of hearing it from the first person was so important. And you know, it was really intentional in thinking about having Kate kind of, you know, verbally say, this is what was feeling good, this is what wasn't feeling good, this was the point where I was feeling really uncomfortable by what you were doing. And of course, also including all of that positive reinforcement as well. But again, we feel like that was really effective and potentially could guide users to making a more kind of positive path on potentially their second try through the simulation.
Thank you, Megan. So this section next is called Helping a Friend, and the goal of this section is to two things. One is to help train students to be upstanders, to support their peers. So if somebody has been a victim of sexual misconduct, if their friend comes to them, they know how to engage in that conversation in a trauma-informed way. We're really making sure that they understand their role in that conversation, that it's really to listen, to have empathy, to give the other person agency, but it's also meant to help them understand what resources are available on campus and know that they can refer their peers to them. What we know is if we have conversations where they're referring somebody else to those and they're practicing that skill set, they're also much more likely to seek to use their own help-seeking behaviors to reach out to those resources as well. So we teach it one way, but we've done significant research and it has been shown to be effective for help-seeking behavior as well. Glenn, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about this because the resources and what's available to students here is really broadly talked about, and then there is a section at the end where it can be related directly to what's available on campus. But I know this is an area that the questions are coming up as well. So if you want to talk a little bit more about this.
Absolutely. Let me start kind of at a 10,000-foot level and suggest that when I was going through the initial version of this program, it was actually this quiet scenario, and it was unexpected. I did not expect this scenario. Wasn't sure exactly where Kognito was going with the helping a friend scenario, and this quiet scenario is actually what sets this training apart. I mean, there's a lot of phenomenal content, and the simulation technology is powerful for all the reasons we've discussed. But this scenario is actually deceptively, while simple, it's deceptively powerful. And here's the reason why. We are going to experience greater inertia now than ever before with regard to students using the resources that all these campuses that are listening in right now have. Using my own, using Pomona College as an example, we have an extraordinary office. It's the CARES office, Campus Advocacy, Resources, Education, and Support Office. And it brings an intersectional approach to partnering our campus resources with community-based organizations. And it covers everything from the community-based Project Sister organization that assists survivors of sexual assault with peer support groups, and all the way to our counseling center, which, of course, hopefully all the institutions have. They're all great to have, but they need to be utilized. And the fact of the matter is, the regulations that you're now all dealing with, if anything, are going to continue to restrict things. Title IX jurisdiction is going to be more limited under the new regulations. As most of you probably now have found out, the concept of mandated reporter is almost obsolete based on the new regulations, and it's certainly going to be changed, and really all the official reports have to come through either the Title IX officer or an official with authority to take corrective action. So that's really going to change the landscape of how you're going to find out about these issues. Therefore, now more than ever, it's that helping a friend concept that I think is going to break through the understandable inertia, particularly, again, given the challenges that we're now facing and the uncertainties that all the students are facing. We really need to ensure that those peer groups and those communications are available. And it starts with using the student body to really create an empathic response to that friend who is in need. So again, the resources are many. They're out there. They'll be listed. The customized versions of these programs will allow you to list them all, but it's great to have them. They got to be used. And I would suggest it's this scenario and this education that makes it by far most effective and most likely to be used.
Yeah, Glenn, and this is Megan. If I might just sort of underscore and reiterate that it's really important, even in sort of this virtual world that we're all operating in right now, to know that on-campus resources are absolutely still available for students no matter where they're living. And again, just to sort of highlight what you were speaking about with that simulation, I think it's really important that students know that they can still reach out to their campus resources even if they are far away from on campus.
Thank you, Megan. And that is a question that has come up. Do students feel that they can relate these types of communication techniques as well? And in our at-risk university student one, we actually teach the techniques over text for that reason, because students do feel that if they know how to listen with empathy, if they know how to use some of those reflective listening techniques, and they know what their role is supposed to be in those moments, they feel so much more confident to be able to support their peers in all types of different conversations about different types of distress and refer them to the resources that are available. The last section of the simulation is called Staying Safe. This is a broad topic, but in what we are trying to do here is begin to introduce the idea of healthy relationships, what those look like, some warning signs of abusive behavior, as well as tips for students who are coming to campus who may not have been in some of these situations before, tips on how to stay safe. Megan, I'd love to have you talk about this section a little bit more, especially since you highlighted it at the beginning, because it's just such an important part of this healthy relationships piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, going off of what Glenn had mentioned and sort of this being, I think one of the unique features of this product really is this piece for me, something that stuck out. I feel like this conversation is just so critical for our students, particularly our first year students who are coming in and maybe aren't, they maybe haven't experienced anything like this before. So they're not only learning skills about their own healthy relationships, but kind of tying it even back to that bystander piece or that upstander, really not only learning the skills for themselves, but then able to sort of identify different traits of relationships and contributing it back to their community, whether that's in the residence hall, their student orgs, or in classes. They're able to really contribute to the overall campus safety piece. And fundamentally, this is allowing students from a kind of, again, 10,000-foot perspective, it's allowing students to persist in their academic pursuits, which is really fundamentally why they're wanting to enroll in college in the first place. So again, from that really high level view, this sort of importance of teaching about healthy relationships can't be underscored enough to our incoming students.
So I just want to talk a little bit about some key things. We do make sure that we are using evidence-based strategies within our simulation. So we work very closely with our SMEs, such as Megan and others, to make sure that things like bystander skills and all of these other type of strategies that we teach are evidence-based. In helping a friend, those communication strategies are based off of things like motivational interviewing, which has a large evidence base to prove out those as effective communication techniques. The user satisfaction piece is core to us. We have a saying that we say internally all the time. We did not make it up. We came to us from someone else, but we sort of live by this mantra now, which is nothing for us without us. And we take that very seriously. So we spend a lot of time with students making sure that not only to do the scenarios relate to them, but also the learning model. Is it something that they feel is engaging, that they're learning, that it was a good use of their time, that they feel more confident afterwards? And so we are very proud of those user satisfaction rates, and we're always looking to make them higher by really, really making sure that students are involved at every stage of the products that we're creating. It's important for us to know that we're building competency, that we're really improving students' life skills here. We have significant research on our other trainings that show significant behavior change and higher self-efficacy after taking it. So those are key to us. We will continue to do that research. We will continue to make sure that students are at the center of everything we build. So that is the basis of how we build these and why evidence is so important to us. So this is the wrap-up screen. Just reiterate some of the things that we have already said. The key here for us is that it's practice-based, that they get to be in these realistic scenarios, that they're getting feedback specifically on their choices that they're making so that it has high fidelity to be able to meet them where they are and really promote positive behaviors while reducing negative ones. We do impact measurements. There are all of the admin tools that are needed to implement this. And we also want to make sure that it is compliant. So I'm actually going to give Glen a little bit of time to talk a little bit, not only about that, but any of the other wrap-up pieces. And then I want to finish, Megan, to have you talk a little bit about, there was a very large group of subject matter experts that worked on this, and some of the diversity of thought that they brought to this as we were building it. So, Glen, turn it over to you first.
Certainly. So for those of you who are compliance officers, maybe legal counsel listening in, of course, Title IX coordinators, obviously we need to make sure that your training is compliant. So a couple things about training and law and regulations. Going way back historically to, what set us all off, which is the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. That letter initially recommended that institutions conduct prevention training programs. The Violence Against Women Act became more prescriptive with regard to the requirements. The training programs had to include all of the definitions that we have here, which again tracked really the Cleary and VAWA definitions requirement, including definition of consent, the fact that the institution prohibits the offenses, safe and positive options for bystander intervention, and the like. Interestingly enough, the new regulations, Title IX regulations, much like the old ones, are pretty silent, particularly on student training. And so it's really left up to you folks and your campus organizations to decide what is going to be the most effective array of training that you can provide. What I would suggest is, obviously, as I said earlier, this program meets and exceeds the definitions with regard to the VAWA definitions, and more specifically, how it approaches concepts of sexual harassment. The one thing that I would mention also is the great flexibility and customization options available to you that were important for us to certify that Kognito offers. Because you will need to, of course, look at your state law jurisdictions and your campus policies, and to ensure that you're creating the kind of, again, common vocabulary that you desire on your campus when you're talking about these critical issues, both practically as well as from a policy perspective. Megan?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And just kind of going off of that, recognizing that in any of these like simulations or trainings that folks do, representation and identity absolutely matters. It matters who the folks are when you're watching the simulation just as much as it matters, and something that I really appreciated about the Kognito team by really intentionally, I think, putting together a really diverse pool of subject matter experts. There were, as Kim mentioned, just so many SMEs that came from just, I think, a diversity of backgrounds from agencies, higher education institutions, ranging from all sort of levels, from entry level to, senior levels at different institutions. And, of course, the variety of size and institutions and the demographic, of course, that matters. And I think that with that intentionality really came to grow this product, which we are hoping, and our intention was that students can sort of see themselves in these characters, in these simulations, so that they can, again, hopefully make the best decision when it is happening in real life. So I don't know, Kim or Glenn, if you had anything additional to add to that, but I was just so impressed by the Kognito team for putting together such a diverse pool of folks.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. You said the word intentionality, and that's key for us, is to be very intentional as we're building out the SMEs. And we had a great group representing different sizes of institutions, different backgrounds, as well as a very diverse group representing different audiences that have higher rates of sexual misconduct. So we wanted to make sure that all of those voices were here and really got a chance to build out what this product was going to be. I want to make sure I give this back over to Maria so we can take some questions. So thank you, Glenn and Megan. I think we'll sort of divvy up the questions as they come in. So I'll turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Megan, for sharing with us and walking us through the content of the new simulation. I want to remind all of our attendees to submit questions. We have quite a few. That there is a PDF in the resource section of the On24 platform that includes a link to the simulation if you'd like to experience how it works for yourself. I know there's a lot of talk about how interactive it is, so we wanted to provide you with a link so you can engage with it and see how it works for yourself. With that, I will start with the first question, which is, I'm going to direct this to you, Kim, and I'll invite Megan and Glenn to also chime in, is how do you create a sexual assault scenario for training that is both true to real life but doesn't trigger or harass the learner?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we spend a lot of time on this scenario specifically. I will say it does start with a trigger warning to let the students know what will be in the scenario. But it's meant to be at the very beginning of the situation. They're both fully clothed, and they're just beginning to sort of dive into this conversation of where it's going. There are both verbal and nonverbal signals that go back and forth. It's broken up with coach text throughout. So it's really meant to help both of the students think through or help the students think through some of the things that they typically hear or they might say that they're pressuring or they're guilting or they're really trying to get somebody to say yes with all different sort of techniques, some verbal, some nonverbal, and making sure that at the point that it begins to become an actual, or before actually it would become anywhere near an assault, we're cutting it off and we're making them start over, so that they understand that they've gone too far and they need to start again. Megan, you were actively a part of a lot of how the scenario would play out. Do you have anything you might want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Kim, you really hit the nail on the head with, again, just to really reiterate that force-fail component where when it gets to a certain point, it really does have them start back at the beginning again. So I think in addition to what you said, that was sort of the other piece that I would add.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, I work at a commuter institution. The scenarios presented today were appropriate for that student demographics. We serve several non-traditional students and we do not have campus housing. Are your products and scenarios a good fit for these types of students in these types of institutions? Cam, if you want to take that.
Sure. So as we were going through, I'm sure you saw that the backgrounds of the scenario were meant to be pretty agnostic. They could easily be imagined as somebody's dorm room, or they could just as easily look like somebody's off-campus apartment or a room in their home, because we're really focusing on the skill sets and not the setting. So we wanted to make sure that they felt realistic to no matter where those students were, while keeping it realistic to something that a student's room might actually look like, or their dorm room might look like.
Great. There are a lot of questions about the customization of resources. And I know you all three of you have covered that to some degree, but if you can just remind attendees of how the resources can be customized within the simulation by institutions.
Sure. So there are quite a few areas throughout the simulation where it talks about the fact that there will be campus-specific resources. So in the definition section, it talks about how your school will have its own definitions and policies. In the section on helping a friend, where you're talking about resources, it talks about the fact that there will be campus resources. It both speaks it and puts it visually on the page. Then there is a resources section at the end that they do have to go through. It is required for them to complete, to go through that section. And it has separate sections with each in that, where you have a place to put your policies, you have a place to, or link to your policies, whichever you choose. And the reason we did that is because to keep that evergreen for the universities, knowing that those change, being able to change it in one place, and then that is how you would do that. And we work directly with our CS team to make sure that all of those are up to date, accurate, that we're connecting with you to make sure that if anything changes, those change. Again, if you choose to hyperlink them to a place that you already keep them up to date, that makes the workload even less, because as you guys change things, it changes automatically within the simulation as well.
Great, thank you. Another group of questions that have come up a couple of times is in terms of the cost of a program like this. Kim, can you talk about how the pricing for institutions work?
Sure, so the pricing is based on student size, and it's tiered, so you'll fit within a tier of the student size of your population. I do believe you put a link so that they could put in pricing requests, and that's the quickest and easiest way to get, based on your school size, what that would be.
Yes, Yes, I will remind everybody to reference that PDF with resources that will give you a shortcut to requesting customized pricing information for your school. With 1 minute, I have 2 questions that I will combine really quickly. Is in terms of, is there any specific platform required to support this training? How turnkey is this solution?
So it's running off of our platform, so there is nothing that a university has to do to support this. There are multiple ways that they can implement it, so they can either have students go directly into our platform by signing in with a code that they are given, or some schools choose to do something like SSO or LMS integration. So that is all optional, but it runs through our platform, so it's very scalable, very turnkey for them to get out to their students quickly.
Great, thank you. For those questions that we did not get a chance to answer due to time, please feel free to reach out to our presenters on the screen. Their contact information is there, or you can use the PDF. There is contact information there as well, and we can answer those questions for you. At this time, I want to thank our presenters for spending the last hour with us and sharing more information about this new simulation. And I also want to thank you as the attendees for joining us and also spending your time with us. I wish you a safe and healthy holiday weekend. Take care. Thank you so much.